Dear students, in this session I would like to begin from page number 149. In this paragraph, starting with by subscribing to a linear and continuous concept of time. In that paragraph, Pradeepan Pampirikunnu is talking about the classification of periods in literary history. What is the significance of it? And how does he disapprove of such classification of different literary periods? And along with that, he is also explaining the concepts of intertextuality and dialogic reading. So let us see what is there in this paragraph. By subscribing to a linear and continuous concept of time, literary history has forsaken intertextuality, which makes possible heterogeneous times. So there is a reference here, intertextuality. What does it mean? Intertextuality is a term coined by Julia Kristeva. It is given there in your notes, note number 1. It is a term coined by Julia Kristeva to refer to the fact that texts are always interrelated and are constituted by a tissue of citations. So intertextuality means we find a reference or a citation of another text within an essay or within a critical piece of work. So there will be linkages, there will be citations, there will be interactions between different texts, even different texts of different periods. So if we try to limit the capacity of a text according to the linear line of time, what happens? We are actually limiting this interconnectedness between texts of different periods, what is termed as intertextuality. By subscribing to a linear and continuous concept of time, literary history has forsaken intertextuality. Forsaken, what is the meaning of forsaken? Discredited or abandoned or rejected, which makes possible heterogeneous times. So it is through intertextuality we can bring in ideas of different times within a particular text. So that possibility of heterogeneity is getting abandoned by the traditional way of looking at literary text according to the traditional literary history. The meaning of a text produced in the 16th or 18th century is not exhausted by available interpretations of that period. Likewise, a particular interpretation by the literary history of a period of any text does not limit the inherent potential of that text for multiple or plural significations. That is a very important sentence. You can underline that sentence. What is there? The meaning of a text produced in the 16th or 18th century. If a text is produced or written during the 16th century or during the 18th century, its relevance and meaning, it is not limited to that particular century of its creation. It can also be interpreted with contemporary relevance even in the 20th or 21st centuries. So that is what here is pointed out. Likewise, a particular interpretation by the literary history of a period of any text does not delimit the inherent potential of that text for multiple or plural significations. We get multiple meanings through such interpretations across the centuries, across different periods of history or different periods of time. We cannot limit a text to a particular period of time. Obviously, it is such a potential of a text that enables a person to quote Bhagavad Gita even today. So, it is with that interpretative capacity or potential of a text that we even quote great texts that had been written a long period ago. Texts like Bhagavad Gita we quote even today. It is even possible for someone to redeploy a text in a period outside that of the determinations of a literary historian, because literary history takes the author and not the text as the standard measure of time. Here we are moving to another aspect. Underline, literary history takes the author and not the text as the standard measure of time. So the author was born in such and such period, and in which period the author was born, according to that literary history is framed. Literary history does not divide texts or does not classify texts into different periods according to the relevance of the text. It is dividing the texts into different periods based on the authors, based on to which period the authors were born. Literary history takes the author and not the text as the standard measure of time. Just as the time in which a text is produced could differ from the time represented in that text, a text time is also not just the time of its creation. So how can we limit the interpretative possibility of a text to that particular period where the author is born? We cannot limit a text and its potential to that particular period. That text can be reinterpreted, even redeployed in a different context, and it can be reread and reinterpreted. So that is the real potential of a text. So how can traditional literary history limit the scope of a text by placing it in a particular period? That is the question asked by the author. Thus, literary history's period-wise classification of the text, even as it accorded priority to the author, becomes insignificant. So this is a very important point that the author makes. So Pradeepan dismisses literary history's period-wise classification as insignificant because the potential capacity, the potentiality of a text, it crosses over ages and ages. But literary history is classifying a text to a particular period based on the period of its author. So such a kind of classification that is insignificant according to the author. In fact, formalists had already maintained that the period in which the author lived and wrote cannot be considered a criterion for studies on literature. When you studied the formalist paradigm, you might have noticed that no importance is given to the author. The concentration is on the text. That is again pointed out here. In fact, formalists had already maintained that the period in which the author lived and wrote cannot be considered a criterion for studies on literature. So in this paragraph, the author talks about the time, the linear and continuous concept of time, what the traditional literary history believes in. And the author rejects this because It abandons intertextuality. It abandons heterogeneous times. And also, it rejects the innumerable capacities and interpretations and potential of a literary work across ages and ages. Now we are moving to the next paragraph. It is quite possible that a text's potential for other dialogic readings will only be realized centuries later. Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat and Pampirikunnu's Saraswati Vijayam in Malayalam are familiar instances of such possibilities. So here we see two references. First one is about dialogic readings. What do we understand by dialogic readings? This is given there in your notes, note number 2. Dialogic readings imply that all language users shift and reshape the meaning of words according to the demands of their situation. This would mean that canonized texts can be politically and imaginatively reread or subverted. Dialogic meaning, it actually refers to the different types of interpretations of a text, the different types of readings and rereadings of the same text. Sometimes the interpretations or the rereadings that we get, the significations after the interpretations and rereadings we get will be totally different from the classical understanding of the text. But it is accepted according to the situation, according to the differences and changes in the course of life throughout the history. So dialogic readings imply that the shift and reshaping of the meaning of words. There is another reference also. Look at note number 3. Rubaiyat is a multi-layered mystic poem by the Persian poet Omar Khayyam. Saraswati Vijayam by Pampirikunnu contextualizes the injustices of caste hierarchy in northern Kerala and the liberation of the lower strata of society through education. So these are the references to the two texts referred to in our essay. So Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat and Pampirikunnu's Saraswati Vijayam, these two texts, they have relevance even today. It is not through the classical or the original understandings of the text that it is even relevant today. It is through a rereading and reinterpretations of the text that these texts become relevant even today. Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat and Pampirikunnu's Saraswati Vijayam in Malayalam are familiar instances of such possibilities of dialogic readings. Time in literary history is not a sacred entity. Setting apart idealization of the text, Benedetto Croce's opinion may be relevant here. And who is Benedetto Croce? Note number 4. Benedetto Croce, 1866 to 1952, was an Italian liberal philosopher, historian and critic who staunchly opposed Mussolini's fascist regime, influenced later intellectuals including Antonio Gramsci. His major works include Philosophy of the Practical Economic and Ethic and Theory and History of Historiography. So, Benedetto Croce, he is basically a historian and philosopher. And he talks about the time and idealization of a text. What does he say? That each text is indefinite cannot be contained in classifications or generalizations. But classifications and generalizations are required for literary history, which are formulated because of practical considerations and are often informed by personal interests. So this is what Benedetto Croce talks about. According to him, each text is indefinite. We cannot limit the potential of a text to a particular period, or we cannot define its meaning related with a particular period or time. It is indefinite, cannot be contained in classifications or generalizations. And this is the shortcoming of literary history. In literary histories, we come across such classifications because it is done for a practical purpose of dividing the different texts according to the different periods. And that purpose behind writing literary history is one of the limitations of literary history according to our author. But classifications and generalizations are required for literary history, which are formulated because of practical considerations and are often informed by personal interests. So I stop here. We will continue the lesson in the next class. Thank you.